You have to get going.
We're going to be back in Colossians this morning, continuing our study through the book of Colossians. Colossians chapter 1, verse 23. Imagine, if you will, a patient who has just had a triple or a quadruple bypass, life-saving surgery, brought back from the brink of very dire health. And the doctor comes to him and says, all right, we've saved your life, we've cleaned out your arteries, but you got to change your diet. You got to start exercising. What would happen to this fictional person if they said, yeah, doctors don't know what they're talking about, I'll be fine, and goes back to the fried food and the lack of exercise? Any predictions? Yeah, not going to last long. If you don't listen to what your doctor has to say when he says something to you, it's not going to go well. And that's a parallel somewhat to our scripture this morning, and we'll see as we go. Just verse 23, so I'm going to read all of 23 to start, and then we'll break it down bit by bit. It says, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel, this is the gospel that you heard, and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Paul begins by telling the church at Colossae that if you continue in your faith, and this is the paradox of our faith, something that doesn't seem to make sense, but it's true, it cannot be destroyed from without. Satan does not have the power to destroy your faith. It has not been given to him. God has made it so that your faith cannot be destroyed. But it can be abandoned. It can be walked away from. It can be given up on. And that is the contrast between the two texts we read this morning in the beginning. John 10, 28 and 29 told us that the sheep that God has given me, my Father has them in his hand, and they can't be taken away. On the other hand, John also goes on in the letter of 1 John to say, hey, not everybody who appears to be a believer really is, because some of them decided not to stay with us. Some of them decided to leave. So you have that contrast. And when you look at these different scriptures and you evaluate that, you realize that salvation is indeed secure and permanent, but it is only proven once it has been validated through continued adherence. Faith has been begun certainly, but it has to be continued. So how can we tell? How can we tell if someone has genuine faith? Well, our scripture here is telling us that those who continue in their faith will have assurance because they have a changed life, because they begin to have Christ-like attitudes and behaviors. You say, well, what of those who do not? What of the people who do not continue in their faith? What of the people who seem like they have become Christians and then they just kind of don't? Well, only God knows for sure, and it is not our place to judge one person or another. But in all likelihood, they were probably not saved in the first place. If you want to read for your own personal curiosity, Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 6 are the place to go. It tells us in this passage, if you continue in your faith, it reminds us that there is no autopilot for your faith. You cannot just turn it on and sit back and relax and let it go. It won't continue on its own. If your faith is neglected, it will eventually be ruined. Think about your houseplants. They look healthy, but if you forget to water them, over time, they're going to start looking sick. And eventually you're going to come back and find some brown stubble and say, wow, guess I haven't watered that one in a while. If it is not fed, it will die. An active role for your faith is required. Certainly we know that only grace can justify us in God's sight. We just learned that from verses 21 and 22 a couple weeks ago. But after that, we must do our part. Works will never save you, but a true Christian must have works in order to prove that their faith is genuine, in order to prove that it is worthy. Paul goes on to say that your faith needs to be established and firm. Only time and effort can make that happen. You cannot have an established and firm faith from the moment you're a believer. It takes time, and there's a learning curve with it. It takes time to fully understand the implications of a newly formed faith. Do you think that everybody who becomes a Christian knows exactly what's going to mean for their whole life in that moment? All the changes, all the different things that it's going to require of them? Of course they don't. It takes time to learn how to live according to the Spirit. It can take years, it can take decades, it can take a whole life to figure it out. But like any discipline worth learning, it also requires effort to make faith grow. Think of the tree. The tree puts down roots for two reasons. For nourishment, to get water, and also to keep it from getting toppled over in every storm. Or think of the athlete training at basic moves and basic techniques so that they can perform well in the contest. Bruce, you taught a lot of basketball. Did you make them practice free throws? Why on earth would you make them practice free throws? It's so boring. Because in game time, you need to be able to perform. And if you don't practice, it's not going to happen. The exact same thing. They don't like it. Oh, come on, we want to play. Let's scrimmage. You make them shoot free throws anyway. The same thing with your faith. Not sure what the actual faith equivalent of shooting free throws is, but you get the point. It requires both commitment and understanding. How can you be established in your faith if you don't know what it is you're supposed to be learning? If you don't know what you're supposed to learn, how can you learn? There was a cartoon that was on when I was a kid that every episode ended with a little statement about how to live life as a good citizen, and they would say, knowing is half the battle. Anyone else remember that one? You guys are too old to remember when I was a kid watching cartoons in the early 80s. There was G.I. Joe. Yeah, you remember? It was a horrible cartoon. If you missed it, you're probably better off. But they always ended with knowing is half the battle. And that is true. You need to know. How can you be firm in your faith if you don't build upon the foundation of the gospel that inspired your faith in the first place? A wise man once said something along the lines of, the wise man builds his house upon the rock. You recognize that, I hope. That was Christ himself saying that. You need to be established and firm in your faith. Not only that, Paul goes on to say, not moved from the hope held out in the gospel. And so you ask yourself, well, what's the hope? What is the hope that the gospel proclaims? Back in verse 22, we learned recently, it is the reconciliation of God's enemies through the death of his Son, and the liberation of the disciples of Jesus Christ from the penalty of sin and death. That is the hope that we must hold on to, that we must grasp. It is hope that will appeal to all peoples at all times. It is hope for the future, for each one of us, and hope for the present. For the present. It is hope found nowhere else in our world. Go out in the world and look for it. You will not find hope like this anywhere else. And it is hope in the person of Jesus Christ. We do not hope in ourselves. If we were hoping in ourselves, most of us would be hopeless. If we were hoping in an idea or a concept or a theory, that wouldn't be all that reassuring, would it? We are hoping in our trust in Jesus Christ. This is the hope that we cannot be moved from. Which brings us to the interesting thing here. This is the art of not moving without standing still. And let me explain that. You see, the church must stay firmly rooted in the message of the gospel. This is the same gospel that was taught by Jesus and preached by the apostles. It is the same gospel which has led the church for the past 2,000 years. It is typified in the Nicene Creed, AD 325. We'll talk more about it in just a minute. This was a statement of the whole church. They came together, they had a council, they figured out what was the minimum thing that we can all agree to. We're not going to all agree about everything, but what can we all agree to? And they came up with these lines relating to Christ and the gospel that should be somewhat familiar to us. They said, "For us and our salvation he came down from heaven. He was born of the Virgin Mary and became a man. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, suffered, died, and was buried. On the third day he rose again in accordance with the Scriptures." That is the truth of the gospel. It has been the truth of the gospel for 2,000 years. Its essence, its core. It cannot be compromised. It must not be forgotten. And yet temptation exists to subtract something from it, to add something to it. Sometimes with good intentions. Some men over the course of church history have said, you know what, we need to tweak this. I can make this better. And some people with unscrupulous motives have said, I've got a motive for tweaking this. Sometimes they do it subtly, sometimes incrementally, one step at a time. Other times boldly and drastically proclaiming a new gospel. Their effort is to try to make the gospel relevant, to try to make the gospel acceptable. They say, you know what, the gospel's just not working in our culture. We need to modify it. It's just not reaching people today. We need to change it. While we fight against that, the church must not stand still. It must be willing to adapt its methods. It must be willing to change its focus if need be, in order to serve the needs of the people. It must also adjust its policies, its procedures, in order to remain viable and available to those who need to hear the gospel, to the lost. You see, the church must not walk away from the gospel for anything, for any reason, at any cost. If you want to, change the music. Go right ahead. Change the building. Change the order of worship. Change the translation, but never change the gospel. Our strict adherence to the gospel of Jesus does not require the church to become habitual, to be set in our ways, to be stubborn. Rather, the church can indeed be an innovator. The church can adapt to its surroundings, but only when the gospel message